Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks to you all for coming. I'd like to especially thank Roger for inviting me to talk today. It's a great pleasure to be interrupting your lunch with a few hopefully provocative remarks about globalization. My title is Why Globalization Abhors a Vacuum: Reflections on the 2008 Economic Crisis and the Shrinking of Political Space. It's a reference to Aristotle's remark in his Physics that nature abhors a vacuum, right? Plainism. In other words, that empty space immediately acts to fill itself up. I think this is bound to a particular way of thinking about the world, nature and ontology, and I'm disinclined to agree with him about that. But I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, but not very much, because it's complicated, and I don't know much about it. Instead, I want to talk mainly about contemporary capitalist political economy. Nature may not abhor a vacuum, but globalization, it seems to me, certainly does, as a metaphor of world-making or world-becoming. It's a space that is constantly and irresistibly, inevitably growing and filling itself in, engulfing national and regional economies into bigger markets, accelerated technological change, faster communication, and a tighter web of world interdependency, all in the name of greater growth and, on balance, something like progress, including historic new possibilities for democratic advances and perhaps even maybe a global cosmopolitanism. This image of globalization tends to persist unblemished even in the aftermath of massive global financial crises. The Mexican peso crisis of '95, the Asian economic flu of '98 and '99, and the most recent global meltdown, 2008, each more dangerous to the global system than the last. According to the political economist Mark Blyth, standard models of finance hold that system-level crises like these are supposed to be exceedingly rare. They're supposed to occur something like once every 10 million years, if the models hold. Instead, they happen once or twice a decade. One reason, I think, why this image of globalism as progress, despite much evidence to the contrary, why this image persists is the worthy desire for a responsible stewardship over capitalism. The problem, I would suggest, is that this very image of globalization is inherently anti-democratic and, in fact, profoundly anti-political. It forecloses too many political responses to globalization by rendering capitalism as a natural process governed by ironclad economic logic that is the same at all times in all places. This global image of capital is too tightly predetermined, too abstractly anti-empirical, too teleological, and this too frequently makes our attempts to democratically steer and resist capitalism, globalizing capitalism, both unthinkable and impracticable. This at a time when there's an urgent need for political responses to capitalism's transformations, as capitalism's laws of motions are insinuated and intertwined ever more deeply into the vital conditions of human life across the planet. You can consider the capitalist politics of food insecurity or global warming, among other possibilities, the enormous scale of the actions and political orderings that are needed here in industry, agriculture, energy, and the lived habits of consumption. Okay, so that's perhaps so far so good. I've just rehearsed a standard democratic critique of neoliberalism, which I trust you have all heard before, right, in one form or another. Globalization imperils democratic power and legitimacy, and that's an important point, but I suspect it's not exactly news to you. All right. And anyway, my title promises to say something about why globalization, as overbearingly teleological as it is, shrinks political space. The tentative answer, the best one I've been able to come up with, is this. Globalization fields elements of totalitarianism in Hannah Arendt's sense. This is not to say that globalization is totalitarian, although it may be getting there at some points in time, in some places. During the first days of the banking collapse 2 years ago, we were on the 2-year anniversary of that, apparently, I read. There were whiffs and traces of totalitarianism's easy slide towards unreality, its paranoid momentum, and its convulsive contempt for public deliberation and the ordinary rule of law. In the space of 3 days, the Treasury Department managed to convince Congress to spend $700 billion for a makeshift bailout package, which included granting the Treasury Department emergency powers of a sort and legal immunity over how the money was to be spent and how the resulting assets were to be controlled. The alternative to this course of action was said to be too horrible to contemplate because it's literally unthinkable and unspeakable. Congress and the public were both instructed to silently imagine the hypothetical worst, much worse than the breadlines and mass homelessness of the 1930s, whatever that means. 3 days of backroom negotiation and zero public debate yielded the Troubled Assets Relief Program. And the tentative consensus now seems to be that it worked in some way, although no one can really specify how or why. I would argue that in the United States there continues to be a frenzied sense of unreality around the economy. This would include the technically informed incoherence of mainstream economics, which according to Paul Krugman can't decide whether we were in an actual depression or not, or where the bailout money went exactly, or whether and how exactly TARP contributed to an early recovery. Also included here is the paradoxical talk, now commonplace, of a jobless recovery, where double-digit unemployment might well become the new standard of normalcy. Double-digit unemployment not long ago was considered to be the threshold for legitimation crisis. It would also include the teabaggers' imminent congressional sweep, driven by a racist ressentiment that allows them to overcome the cognitive dissonance of simultaneously opposing the ballooning federal debt, the drawdown of our expensive deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, the repeal of Bush's tax cuts for the super wealthy, and the cost savings of healthcare reform, all while appealing angrily to a brass tacks, populist, empirical common sense. Is the globalizing United States totalitarian then? I suspect that Arendt would say no, but there are Arendtians who say maybe. One of them is Sheldon Wolin, who notes that the very variability of classic totalitarianisms, say the distance between cousins Mao and Mussolini, suggests that this form of power may mutate and travel in surprising ways. Wolin argues that there is an emergent form of totalitarianism, what he calls inverted totalitarianism, IT, that was in play in the United States during the most recent Bush administration. IT inverts the classic form by making its peace with a circumscribed constitutional democracy, managing its outcomes through an expertly deracinated political class. IT departs from the classic form by letting corporations do their thing rather than nationalizing them via corporatism. IT eschews mass repression in favor of the gently systematic cultivation of a privatized, demobilized citizenry, a demos drunk on entertainment technology and other deep practices of reality avoidance, and is therefore more insulated from the palpable pressures of empire and endless expansion. IT is like its progenitors bent on supremacy, conquest, and the globalization of its power. It is therefore, like the classic form, quite uninterested in respecting boundaries. Crucially, IT, again like the classic form, militantly disrespects the epistemological boundaries of prudence and realism, the kinds of boundaries between fact and fantasy that divide mission accomplished from unfathomable catastrophe. The Bush years then have made Wolin, quite rightly and I think presciently, freaked out. He chillingly describes the trace outlines in available political space for an inverted U.S. style of totalitarianism. I nonetheless harbor a few doubts about its actuality in the here and now. I think a bigger worry is the role of global capitalism in his account, though. Wolin often figures globalization as an instrument of U.S. empire rather than a force that exceeds U.S. hegemony and even U.S.-style neoliberalism. But of course, America's imperial overreach does not take place in a vacuum. It is situated within a shifting array of economic forces with a growing list of emerging rivals, chiefly among them China, whose investment in the U.S. bond market made the Iraq adventure possible. I said that globalization abhors a vacuum because it fields elements of totalitarianism. The group of elements I have in mind are those of European imperialism, repurposed for an era of boundless economic integration. Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism is of course an analytic account of totalitarianism in full bloom, but it's also a story about origins, processes, strange turns, aleatory events, and the formation of constituent elements and their anticipatory arrangements. Imperialism is one such arrangement of elements. Arendt makes a great deal of Cecil Rhodes' remark, "I would annex the very planets if I could." The deathly veracity of that line mirrors the peculiar spatial imagination of the expansionist nation-state, a territorial imaginary that first rigidly fixes its domestic borders and then suddenly stakes its material survival on a zero-sum game of global conquest, a hopeless one. Expansionism is Arendt's name for this thinking of power as infinite space, a space that is specially tailored for financial speculation, free trade and the laws of comparative advantage, and infinite wealth accumulation as an end in itself. The space of imperial expansion, on Arendt's account, fields capitalism within a particular range of the social, a working topography of exploitation and domination. The space is wrenched violently from the nation's political bodies, parliament, civil society, the press, and supports a colonial apparatus that is contemptuous of politics and law, preferring instead long-term emergency powers and nebulous administrative logics, the better to secure the immediate relief of troubled assets. In her preface to the Imperialism volume, Arendt sees a neo-imperialism developing between the US and the Soviet Union, an expansionism that seeks to fill the power vacuums of colonialism. She wishes that the Americans and the Russians would leave those spaces be, so that the work of national liberation, which she lukewarmly endorses, could be fielded without proxy warfares or other hegemonic gravities. She wants a different range of territorial politics. She voices a hope or two about the British Commonwealth as an alternative form of non-national sovereignty, for example. Still, the future of non-expansionist politics in the post-colonial world seems bleak to her. It seems bleak to me too. But I think that the non-expansionist theory of political space, which I think is a distinctly Arendtian one, is one that I would like to suggest that democratic citizens of globalization pursue. I think this would necessarily entail a different theory of capitalism, one that doesn't pursue capitalism as being a sort of convergence model in the process of unfolding, but rather a system that is as productive of divergences and dissonances and stochastic events as it is productive of convergence and integration. It would also see a wider range of levels and scales to capitalism that go beyond national markets and supranational entities, and also think more consistently about regions and niche markets. And finally, it would jettison the idea that capitalism as a material state of affairs is governed by some kind of teleological equilibrium. This is an image of capitalism as a non-objective field, as an open-ended state of affairs that's more like a growing complex of local spaces than the emergence of a world market. And some of these spaces, of course, are going to be better than others. And I think that conception of capitalism as locally inclined would allow more political and theoretical space for macroeconomic experimentation and considerations of alternatives to what only seems to be inevitable. Thanks.
Thank you.